everyone, welcome back to the Sport Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, going to be doing something different. This is episode number 100 of the Sport Psych Show. And so, going to celebrate, or at least I think it's a celebration. Somebody's come onto the show to interview me today. So what we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to welcome back Dr. Scott Goldman. Scott, welcome back.
It's honestly an honor and a privilege. I'm really excited to see what happens today.
Well, I'm super excited. We did back-to-back episodes. It was episode numbers 77 and 78. And we had some awesome conversations. And you said, not long after, hey, you know what? Have you ever thought about being interviewed yourself on your own show? I'm absolutely honoured to be, I suppose, interviewed by you, be willing to come back on. And, this is going to be a conversation. It's not just going to be about interviewing me, but it's going to be a conversation. But, it's great to have you back, mate.
Oh, it's like I said, this is a real joy for me. I think what really sparked the idea was our conversation continued offline. And what was amazing is how much we really kind of tracked and had an alignment in our vision. And I said, gosh, I think it'd be really neat for your audience to be able to hear some of these things that, you're very selfless during the interview process where you're constantly getting your guests to elicit some of their thoughts. And then when you shared yours with me, I went, I think people would really want to hear these ideas. So I'm glad that you're willing to take up this opportunity. Let's see what happens.
Let's do it. I'm just pleased that you thought that some people would like my rambles. But look, let's do it. So you're the interviewer this time. So fire away, mate.
All right. Well, I think a place to start would be. I don't know how many or how much of your audience knows about your journey. So, where did you start? When did it start for you?
The journey of sports psychology for me started in my mid-teens, I would say, which sounds phenomenally young. I was an amateur golfer, was my main sport. I'd played all sports as a kid, but really as a teenager, I was perhaps a little bit guilty of early specialization. I was playing and practicing golf, obsessed with it, I suppose, from the age of 13, and that's really when I started the sport, probably a little bit too late in many respects. And around about my mid-teens, my mother bought me a book on sports psychology, and it was actually an academic book. So I don't know if it was the most practical introduction to sports psychology, but from there I can't remember how I managed to get hold of a copy of Timothy Galway's In a Game of Golf, which is obviously the follow-up to In a Game of Tennis, his iconic early 1970s book. One of the earliest, although not a traditional sports psychology book, one of the sort of the early coaching psychology books, if that's what you want to call it. Enjoyed it. It's a bit funky in places, but found it useful. And then I moved on. I graduated. As I left school, didn't go to university. I decided to play professional golf straight away. And then I picked up Dr. Bob Rotella's book, Golf is Not a Game of Perfect. And to me, it's been incredibly influential on me, but certainly enormously influential in the golf industry. And I do just wonder if it's the first book to come along whereby a sports psychologist has written something where he's not really focused on theory. It's just very practical ideas and storytelling. As a consequence, it really brings some psychological philosophies and techniques alive. And that was, every golfer at that time was reading it, and I was, and trying to put it into practice. And then as my golf career, what emerged, I just really wasn't good enough. And it's interesting, actually, Scott, because I think I was somebody who overthought stuff. So there's one thing learning about sports psychology and other components of the game. It's another thing if you learn it and then you're constantly thinking about it and constantly critically analysing it, and I think that was me. And so it soon became apparent I'd probably be far better coaching the game So I started to coach. I did my PGA qualifications here in Britain, Professional Golfers Association. And I just fell in love more and more with the psychological side of golf and sport in general. And as I was coaching golf, golf is one of these coaching professions where you're doing it 40 hours a week. You know, you're teaching non-stop. And again, that was a great experience. You know, you're dealing with lots of different people. Different ages, different attitudes, different personalities, etc., etc. And I just decided to go to university at that time. I did my first degree in psychology, then did my master's degree in sports psychology, and then came to a crossroads. It was, am I going to be a golf coach and have these qualifications on the side, or do I want to do sports psychology full stop? And I chose the latter. Had supervision and became a registered psychologist here in the UK, which is driven by the HCPC, the Health and Care Professions Council, and that's what I've done since. So that was, around 2005, 2006, when I was really started to push through on that one.
Sounds like that was a fundamental decision in your life. Like, do I go left or do I go right? Do I be a coach or do I be a psychologist? What do you think was the catalyst that caused you to go towards psychology?
Several things. I really wanted to work in other sports. I love golf, but I was very burnt out in golf. A lot of my philosophies now are the foundation of that. Comes from being burnt out as a golfer. But I wanted to explore other sports, and I just felt intellectually, and I think this, I'm being a bit unfair what I'm about to say, because I think this landscape has changed, because I think the coaching landscape now, certainly in the UK, we've got a lot of coaches doing master's degrees, professional doctorates, so on the job, doctorates. That landscape has changed in the last 15 years in the UK, but at that time, I just felt I could intellectually and academically get more from a career in sports psychology than a career in coaching. As I said, I think that's not true of today necessarily, but that's how I felt at the time. And I just was, I was just probably more in love with psychology than I was with golf, to be quite frank.
So why did your mom put the book in your hand?
You're such a psychologist.
Tell me about your childhood.
Absolutely. I think that I think, to be honest, she just found out that it was a potential career pathway for a young person who's really into sport. Academically, I lost my way at school for various reasons. And I think at the time, probably my mum was subtly saying, now's the time you need to think about the future. But hey, when I was 15 years old, it was, I'm going to be a golfer. I'm going to be a golfer. Don't care, I'm going to be a golfer. And I only had a 7 handicap. Like, I wasn't a great golfer. And I never became a great golfer. But that handicap came tumbling down to 2 to scratch. The problem is that 17, 18-year-old off scratch, your Rory McIlroys are playing off +5, your Tiger Woods are playing off +5. They're streaks ahead. That doesn't mean a scratch golfer at 18 can't become a professional golfer. My understanding, someone like Ian Poulter, who became a top 20 player, was a 4 handicap at 18. So it is possible. But I was just determined to be a golfer, and nothing was going to put me off of that. And I just think it coincided with underachieving at school. So I think I got that book because my mum was basically saying, let's have a think about what you're going to do in the future, and this is an option, which, weirdly, it became my choice.
So going back and keeping that athlete hat on for a sec, why do you think some athletes kind of gravitate towards this resource and others don't? What is the makeup that causes people to be introduced to sports psychology and go, oh my gosh, this is like I'm able to see color for the first time, and others are like, I don't get it. It seems like a bunch of hooey.
Good question. I think I'm going to say 2 things. I'm going to say I'm going to say three things. I'm going to say context. I'll expand. I'm going to say context. I'm going to say, I need to think of a better word than this, but nature, as in the nature of the sport. And I'm going to say, as in individual or team, and then I'm going to say personality. And I know, Scott, how much you love personality science. Not, but I'll come back to the audience. Can't see you smiling there. I'll come back to that. Context. I think I came from golf, and I think golf is just there with this stuff. There's very few. Do I think Brooks Koepka, the world number one, is seeing a sports psychologist right now? No, I don't. Do I think he's possibly seen somebody, probably in the past? I think just about every golfer has on the planet. Tiger Woods is, it's well documented. He saw a naval clinical psychologist at the age of 13 years old. A guy called Dr. Jay Brunzer. So I think I personally came from that context of this is golf. So I think it's a peculiar sport in that sense. And I think if we're looking at, let's say, soccer in England, and we're looking at, if I may say so, say NFL, so American football, if baseball, basketball, where perhaps the culture has been more, and we can go on to talk about this, top down. You are responsible for your attitude, effort, and energy. We are coaching culture. We can't help you here. It's up to you. You've got to bring it to the table. You've got to toughen up. I think that's a context as well. You might come back at me there. That might be an interesting conversation between us. So I think context of the sport, the social dynamic of the sport matters. I think the nature of the sport can matter. So we go back to this notion of golf is an individual sport, self-paced. So it makes sense that there's time to think. Every soccer player I work with goes, it makes sense that golfers would see psychologists. Whereas I think more of a fast-paced sport, a team sport, that doesn't automatically those sports don't lend themselves necessarily to, we have to see a sports psychologist, in my opinion. And then the final thing, I'm going to go with some personality theory here, and I think let's go on trait theory. Let's go on openness to experience. And something I've noticed, not something that I think it can be empiricized, but I think that when I reflect back on the teams I've worked with, and I think about the players who have been the naysayers within the environment in terms of working one-to-one, in terms of engaging in animatedly and openly in a group session, I reckon if you did an NEO, a gold standard personality test, my hypothesis is they would come out as either low open or low agreeable. Low agreeable as in very straightforward, and low openness, probably low openness more actually. It's just very fixed and rigid with routines, things they like, won't necessarily want to seek counsel, would prefer their own methodologies. I think personality does make a difference there, and that is a cocktail as well of what they've grown up. So the traits with their own characteristic adaptations, the environment they've grown up in, the influence of their parents, the influence of their early coaches. I think that will make a difference to how they experience psychology. But their experiences with parents and their experiences with peers and their experiences with coaches can render them to be low open, rather than it being a genetic predisposition. So there's my waffling answer for you, Scott.
It sounds like it's a yes with a but and a no with an if.
Typical psychology.
So, but it's interesting because you said I might challenge you for a moment, and just to kind of take a brief left turn, I think what's really interesting is the lens that you answered the question with, because I think you were really talking about kind of like mental skills application. But if you think about concepts like leadership development, or if you talk about, and I don't like the word culture because I think that's now been a nebulous and kind of poppy sort of phrase, but if you talk about human interaction, so you're talking about individual sports versus team sports, I would add that as much as you can do this individual introspection mental skills training, there is also the idea of a human interaction element that is also very psychological, which is, how do we get sort of everybody rowing the boat in the same direction? But that leads to a much more philosophical question that I had for you, and I think this is a good time to insert it, which is, how do you define psychology?
Let me come back on your. Let me come back on the answer on the answer you gave yourself before that. 100% correct, and it's really interesting because if anything, this is my own heuristic bias that I immediately, even subconsciously, just go to mental skills. And it's something that I've got to be very mindful of because you asked me the question and I've answered it in a very mental skills way. I completely agree with what you said there. And I think if I go back to North American sport, I think that's where North American sport, on that leadership, teamship side of things, has been way ahead globally for the last 40 years. And you're always looking for those kind of books. The first books you go to are the North American books, like Coach K's book and books from NFL, that historically North American sport has been so far ahead on I think the group level, the leadership level, the ships, the teamship, the relationship, the leadership. So I think you're spot on, and I might get your thoughts on that in a second as well. Defining psychology. What are you asking me here? Are you asking for my succinct definition of sports psychology, or are you asking me to broaden a sort of how I see that framework, if you like, of what we offer?
All right. So again, what happens when you put two psychologists in the room, right, and have a conversation? I think you're anticipating where I'm going with this. So I'll give you. It was really a 3-part question. So I was going to do it one at a time, but seeing how you're deciphering the code, I'm going to start to call you Neo from the Matrix. I think the real question that I wanted to ask was, how do you define psychology? How do you define sports psychology? And then what's the difference between the two? So that would be the 3-pronged question.
Psychology is the study of human behavior. Sports psychology is the study of human behavior in a sports setting.
And then what's the difference?
Other than answering that in the obvious way of obviously sports psychology is in a specific domain, I think that it's for me, and I'm hoping you're going to give a much better answer here. It's not so much the difference between sports psychology and psychology, because in my simplistic world, it's just, hey, that's in a specific, it's psychology within a specific setting. However, we obviously borrow as in sports psychology from evidence from general psychology, developmental psychology, counseling psychology, etc. I think it's the difference between psychologists and sports psychologists, and it's just having that domain expertise. So it's the application of psychological principles, theories, methodologies within a sports setting. And I think part of our training is, and probably requires, some knowledge of sports science, skill acquisition within sport, the capacity to understand the sports landscape. It doesn't mean you have to have played sport to the top level or any level. It doesn't mean that you have to know all the personalities within sport, but you've got to be willing to learn the language and the specific challenges that sports people tend to face within their sporting landscape. So I think it's a domain expertise thing, and I think the divide is more about ologist rather than ology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it makes great sense. And I kind of want to go one step deeper with this idea of domain expertise. So before we go any further, one thing that I would love as just a side note, you mentioned that North America might be leapfrogs ahead. I think that that's sometimes just neighbors looking over the fence to see and seeing the grass being greener, because in North America, I can tell you that we're reading all of, Sir Alex Ferguson's work, or we're trying to study the All Blacks, so I think it's always this idea of somebody out there is doing it better than I am, right? Which I think the imposter syndrome creeps up on everybody. But let's stick with this definition of sports psychology for a sec. I think there is some debate between, is sports psychology a specialization or is sports psychology a special population? And what I mean by that, and your answer kind of triggered this thought, is, specialization is the idea of having really unique skill sets to manage and navigate the craft. And a special population is the idea of understanding the unique aspect of the individual and what's going on in their lives. The best example that I've come up with is there are certain personality inventories that will ask, true or false, you're on the cover of a magazine. Well, with some of the people that we work with, they would answer true, but the intention of that question being asked in the personality inventory is to actually pop out if somebody's lying or has delusions of grandeur. So that particular personality inventory doesn't work for this special population. So I guess I bring it back to you, which is sports psychology a specialization or is it a special population?
Firstly, I love that. I really, really love that. I think that that's succinctly put, and I think it's kind of my answer on heat. Essentially, it's a more succinct and more efficacious answer. I'd like to think it's both. I'd like to think, what I love about your answer there is I've written it down, I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking, if I can strive to master both of the skill sets incorporated into those, so a specialization, a unique skill set for sport, and then the capacity to understand and work with a special population. I don't know if I'm copping out here by saying I think it's both. I think I would say I wonder if as sports psychologists some of us are better at doing one half of that than the other, and I wonder if our own self-actualization as sports psychologists, it lends itself towards how much can we master both of those.
I love that. So let's go with that word, self-actualization. Are you self-actualized personally and professionally? And if so, could you share with us how you did it so we can somehow walk the same path?
Nowhere near. No. Are we ever? Look, we can bring this back to the cliched answer of we're always learning and it's a journey and we never arrive at our destination. One way I'd like to answer that question is that my growth as a sports psychologist, a consultant, has accelerated. Thank you. Accelerated as well. My growth has accelerated through this podcast, for example. And I want to come back to answer this question, I want to come back to that notion. You picked up on it when you heard me talk about mental skills. I answered the question and I was very mental skills oriented, and how I believe I have this bias towards that. because I fully recognize that sports psychology and sports psychology skills and being a sports psychologist is it's a very multi-dimensional thing. We can take in a lot of things: coaching science, counseling psychology from a welfare and well-being perspective, skill acquisition, organizational psychology. I mean, I'm completely biased, but we might be the Swiss Army knife of the sports scientists, right? So I think that, and sports scientists I'll be getting a lot of complaints about that, I'm sure, and I think sports scientists are great, but I think we can offer a lot.
Wait, can I jump in? Because now I'm very curious.
Yeah.
When you say that we're the Swiss Army knife, which I agree with, is that a compliment or a criticism?
I think it can be. I don't think it's a compliment or a criticism. I think it can be an advantage and a disadvantage. I think it can be a strength and a weakness, or a limitation, in as much as I think sometimes we as a profession find it very hard to succinctly define what we do. And I think I think we had a conversation about this briefly when in one of our podcast episodes, where we talked about where North American sport is going with psychology and how it's treating it and who's making up their minds in terms of what it's all about. Is it a clinical discipline? Is it mental skills training? And you were sort of talking to me about how some of the organizations themselves are saying, well, this is what we want and this is what you do. So I think that it's a strength and a weakness. So we can be very diverse and we can be very versatile, but I think that can make things a bit fluffy. Because psychology covers a raft of areas, I think sometimes it's difficult to pinpoint what we can do. And I think that negotiation process is very important for sports psychologists at the beginning of any tenure. What are we doing here? What are our objectives? What do we want to achieve in year one? What does that look like? What are we covering? Because it can be a raft of things. Does that resonate with you?
No, I think you're pretty spot on, and I think what I would pull from your answer, that mining gold in a pile of gold, is role clarity is essential.
Yeah.
I think if someone were to say, if a young professional were to ask me, what's the secret to having a really successful experience with an organization, it's make sure that there's role clarity, because you can fall in a lot of different buckets and you might act outside of a scope of expertise like you talked about, or you might be under the assumption that you can do X when really Y is where you sing or dance. And so I think that's a good point.
And I think that's a differentiation between us and other areas. If we are going to put sports psychology under the umbrella of sports science, and many people don't, and that's fine, but let's say we do, I think that's where there's a differentiation, because I think that when a strength and conditioning coach or a sports scientist goes into an organization, by and large, there's role clarity there straight away. It's an obvious process. Now, that strength and conditioning coach might say, well, I'm going to borrow from this theory, or I'm going to use this framework, or I'd like to use this philosophy. But I just wonder, in sports psychology, we can cover a raft of areas, and that's where that role clarity can become something that needs to be done right at the beginning, and we don't always do that.
So one of my favorite coaches that I got a chance to work with, when he asked me to come on board full-time, I was a consultant, and he asked me to come on board full-time, I asked him why. And he said, because we're better when you're around, which is an unbelievable compliment, especially in sports. But I, of course, me being an agitator, I said, well, what is it that you think I do? And he said, I don't know. I just see you running around having meaningful conversations and impactful conversations. Like, you see things and you interact with people in those moments, which I'm grateful that he saw that and recognized that impact. But even that has a very nebulous, sort of vague job description. Like, how do you even put that on paper? So I guess I bring that back to you, which is, in the best gig that you've had, the best where you felt the most comfortable, you were making the greatest influence, we're talking about your greatest career moment to date, because I'm sure there's plenty more to come. What made that work so well? What were you doing? What was your role clarity? What was it that they were asking for you? What made the system just click with you? Or you click with the system?
I think number one is we entered a negotiation early as to what that role was. And my experience in the profession is sometimes you don't get that opportunity. When I reflect back, we had a negotiation, they were flexible, and I was able to help them understand where I felt I could contribute to the organisation the most. However, with the caveat of, in year one, I will be doing a lot of watching, asking a lot of questions, and gaining permission to be able to do that. Knowing what I know now, and knowing and having been through the pitfalls, I think it was that lovely juxtaposition between, let me come in and observe. I don't 100% know what you need from me because I don't know your context. I don't know your culture. I know your sport. I love your sport. I've worked in your sport before, but I don't 100% know. And at the same time, this is also what I want to bring to the table in year one. So you feel you get some value added. I'm not going to have hits all the time. I'm going to have some misses. That's okay. And so there was this wonderful sweet spot of negotiation. And the more experienced I've become, the more I think those opening conversations are so important for sports psychologists. Because when I reflect back when failure is a strong word, but perhaps when my practice hasn't worked within an organisation, or even with an individual, because I do a lot of work with individuals, it's that we haven't had a good enough initial conversation or series of conversations to lay down exactly what we're doing and having some flex in terms of what we're doing. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, it's almost a leap of faith between the two entities to say, hey, if we do a little bit of heavy lifting on the front end, the return on the back end will be a multiplier of that effort, right? If we have a conversation or if we have a year of absorption, then there should be this return of investment on the back end. So knowing that your audience is comprised of some sports psychologists as well as some coaches, and let's say that we get to play the role of matchmaker on this conversation, what are some concrete tips, questions to ask, or really specific things that either party could execute? The coach who's going, hey, I want to bring on somebody like Dan, or somebody who's going, I want to be the next Dan. What are some concrete things that both of these entities, individuals, can do to help ensure the success of the relationship?
Are you asking me, sorry Scott, are you asking me if one was to sit down with an organisation, how you can have that negotiation?
Yeah, similar. So I'll be real concrete. There was a Major League Baseball team that brought me out for an interview, and the vice president said to me, we're committed to this, we just don't know what this is, which I thought was an astute part on his point for him saying, we want sports psychology, I just don't know how to set it up, I don't know how to create it, I don't know what to do with it, but I want it. I want it because other teams have it. So he was kind enough and vulnerable enough to show he didn't know what to even ask. Similarly, I'm sure you've had plenty of practitioners that have said, I would love to do the job that you did here. I'd love, my dream is to work with the English national rugby team. How did you do that? And so I guess what I'm saying is you have an opportunity. Again, think like this is the dating game, the 1970s game show, where you get to prep both the contestants, right? You get to talk to the coach and say, hey, coach, if you want this, here are some things that you want to really have clear, like role clarity, or here's some very specific questions you're going to want to ask that provider, or how you're going to want to set that provider up for success by creating X, Y, and Z elements in an environment. And then we'll follow it up with, okay, practitioner, here are some things that you're going to want to do to be the architect or the designer of this job. Because again, even if they've had a previous sports psychologist, they might be looking for something different, which is why they're bringing you on board. So how can you help both of these parties be successful in forging a really good relationship and outcome?
It's a great question. So I think my first answer to that would be a question which is possibly either practitioner or organisation can ask, which is, we could time frame this, what does success look like? What would success look like? After 1 year, what would success look like? Having worked as a sports psychologist here. Or if you're the sports psychologist, after 1 year, I've been here a year, what would you want to have seen? What would you have wanted to be implemented? I think for both parties, questions can be pretty powerful. I think for a consultant going in, an alternative question could be, what's worked? You've had sports psychologists here previously. What's worked? What have you enjoyed? What's worked within your environment? What's been strong? What have players liked? Or when previous psychologists have been successful here, what have they done? What processes have they put in place? So I suppose what I'm doing there, let's just take it from a consultant's perspective. I'm being quite solution focused here, I suppose. It's what's good, what's strong within the organisation related to sports psychology, or what does a future perfect look like, where any problems go away, which is a very solution focused framework. But I like that approach because I think it instigates a great conversation. And I think it can be used the other way around if you're an organisation asking the consultant. And that kind of inductive process, I think, is a really powerful way to go about it. I remember talking to I worked last year with a soccer club in Europe, and it's exactly what the manager or head coach, managers would say in the UK, did. Which I just think was fantastic, because I think what head coaches can tend to do is they tend to go into an organisation with their philosophies, their frameworks, their style of play, as they might call it, their principles of play or game models, and they don't necessarily ask questions about, what the organisation has been using, what the past incumbents have been using, what the players have been used to. And so there can be a clash. So I just think finding out what works, what's strong, is a kind of an appreciative inquiry that can lend towards the kind of information collecting that can lead to an efficacious consulting process. Just to add to that, there are clearly some general principles that I would be inclined to work towards, one of them being integration, as an example. I think historically there's been a big problem with integration versus isolation. Sports psychology has tended to be isolated. I don't know if my memory serves me incorrectly, but we may have spoken about this on one of the podcasts we previously had. And I'm, like I suppose most sports psychologists are, I just think integration is so important if we're going to be impactful. And I just wonder if it's a critical essential for practice to be efficacious within an organisation. I think integration across coaching staff, across playing staff, I think is so important. Tough to do, but I think it's important.
It's really interesting when you talk about integration. I think you are 100% correct on that. But it also now begs a new series of questions, which is when integration, which is magic, again, kind of focusing on a relationship dynamic, like integration is almost like a guy and a girl, a guy and a woman go on a date and it works versus, a guy and a woman go on a date and it doesn't work. And so the question is that the guy, is that the woman, or is it just the two of them would work better off with other individuals, just not with each other? So I bring it back to the world of sports psych and the consulting, which is, in your opinion, what do you think is the better predictor of success? A really open, invested environment, like a manager or a coach who really believes in this stuff, and the onboarding and the introduction and the woven, like, hey, I want you to travel with the team and sit on the sidelines? Or is it the dynamic provider who earns all of those kinds of opportunities but maybe isn't given them initially? Or is it the interaction between the two? In other words, is it more, from a provider's perspective, is it more about luck? Like you've stumbled onto a organization that really is investing in this, and therefore you have a chance to grow and integrate and be woven into the fabric? Or is it more about the provider who's dynamic that then earns that weave?
I think it's important for a sports psychologist to acknowledge where they are at the beginning of that consultancy practice, to be open and honest with themselves. I've entered into consultancy arrangements where I've known, say, that the head coach or the manager who maybe in the sports I've consulted in hasn't been very interested in sports psychology, but at some point has accepted that in a modern day organisation they have to have some kind of psychological offering, and might have a narrative of shrugging it off and going, well, the psych's there and she can help with the well-being. And I think that in that circumstance you've got to know where you are, because if you're not honest with yourself, you're going to start engaging in conversations that can very quickly lead to your downfall. And then it becomes a very skilled process of navigating yourself within the organisation, demonstrating competence to increase credibility, finding gaps potentially, I suppose being quite, would intrapreneurial be the right term here? So finding some gaps, maybe coming up with some solutions for those gaps, finding allies within the organisation, and then rather than, if you do find yourself with an opportunity to have a conversation with that head coach or any other person who's skeptical, perhaps navigating by, rather than insisting, that leads to, as we know, resisting or resistance, it's just starting that conversation, starting a relationship, but potentially also being brave enough to ask what their opinion is of their psychological approach, or what their psychological approach is, and looking again for gaps to add value where you can. So I think that, I suppose I'm getting a little bit detailed here, but I think that anything is, you can navigate yourself through anything, you've just got to know where you start. So I think I've kind of answered your question there.
No, it's I'm dialed in. This is fascinating. So I think we've done a pretty deep dive into kind of like the brick and mortar and the nuts and bolts, right? Like, which might be, I hope, entertaining, but might be less entertaining, right? It's like no one really wants to know how sausage is made. So there's a part of me that would love to take a left turn and start to go down more of a philosophical road and hear just some of your thoughts on a more, not necessarily existential plane, but maybe just more of the idea or the concepts that can fall within sports psychology. Are you willing to kind of go on that ride with me for a little bit?
Yeah, let's do it.
So I guess one place to start is, what is a universal truth for you? What's a go-to intervention or a staple application that you like to apply, regardless of sport or team or person?
I'm going to answer this, and I don't know if I'm concretely answering your specific question, but a universal truth for me that would be highly controversial is that every single competitor needs a mental skills framework. That to me is a universal truth. And I actually fully expect you to disagree with me on this one, which would be cool. I'm a believer that through my experiences playing coaching and in sports psychology, because I think that the complexity of human beings, I'm talking at a competitive level here, I'm not talking about a 10-year-old kid who enjoys participating in sport. The complexity of human beings, the biopsychology of human beings, the notion of us functioning cognitively, motivationally, emotionally, behaviorally in a parallel fashion rather than a serial fashion, that our system can easily become overwhelmed. The complexity of human beings, the complication of the sports we play. So sports are complicated. They're hard. Okay, complexity is in different levels, on different levels. So the complexity of human beings, the complication of sport, means that every single competitor who is serious about competition requires a mental skills framework. And to me, it is simply not good enough to say, I'm mentally tough, or I'm good at this. And I'll explain why, because certainly if it's a team sport, well, great, you've got a great chance to be mentally strong or mentally tough or mentally skillful or whatever term we want to use. That's great as an individual, but if you're in a team sport, that's half the battle won. You need to be able to help others.
So then what is a mental skills framework? Can you define that?
I mean, for me, it would be a high performance mindset. So what is my best mindset? You could call it an ideal performance state, a peak performance state. But what do I do, or what experiences am I having motivationally, emotionally, cognitively? What am I doing behaviorally when I'm at my best and or when I'm experiencing my best mindset? I think that's imperative for every sports competitor to know, to be able to overtly articulate, because I don't think it's good enough to have implicit knowledge. I think there has to be explicit knowledge. So to know it, to be able to articulate it, and to be able to share it, to empower others to help them be able to enact it on game day, coaches to be able to help them enact it on game day.
So let's say that there's an athlete out there who's like, I love it. I need to have a mental skills framework. I get it now. I got to figure this out. What's a universal truth that they should add as a component to that? A place to start, if you will.
I would say a universal truth, and I always feel we're on shaky ground when we're talking about truths. But let's go with this. I would say, objectively speaking, maybe if you're an ecological psychologist, you might push back here, but universally speaking, we would all say we have a memory. If we're a serious competitor, we've all competed before. And so I think a great starting point is tapping into a player's memory and asking them about their best performance as a forerunner to inquiring about their mindset when they were at their best. Tell me about your best performance, I think, is an imperative question that needs to be asked more often by athletes themselves, by coaches to athletes. It's a question I'm asking athletes all the time. Tell me about you at your best. So we're tapping into memory.
What would be a memory for you? When were you at your best?
I shot 8 under par in a local tournament, and I decided that I was going to give myself a tick for every shot that I took charge of that shot, rather than let the shot take charge of me. And boy, I wish I'd done that more often in my career.
So is that your best moment overall, or is that just your best moment as an athlete? Was there a best moment as a sports psychologist?
Oh, as a sports psychologist, that was as a golfer. Whether one defines a golfer as an athlete, more so now. Not sure I was.
And I guess what I'm asking is that your best moment, or was that just your best moment under one category? Because it's possible that was your best moment. I'm just wondering, was there a better moment, a better best moment? Was there a better best moment as a sports psychologist, or is that the one that you like to go back to?
I definitely think for memory banks, I would then compartmentalize and go, well, when was the best moment as a sports psychologist? Oh, wow, I'd have to think about that. It would definitely be, say, I'll go with one. I might kick myself later, but I remember delivering a session where I was really on it. You know, you will have experienced this. And when I reflect back, I think about body language, I think about expression, I think about clarity, articulating, I think about what I did before that presentation, I think about the reactions, I think about incorporating a few, even though it was a presentation, a few interactive sequences within the presentation, and it leads to a template that enables me to go, okay, I want to perform. If I want to perform like that, here are my clues. Here are my clues as to what I did. I think excellence leaves clues. Now, that's not to say that, and those clues can be a part of that mental skills framework. And it's not to say that those clues are going to, those clues that lead to the high performance mindset means we're going to definitely have high performance. It does. If I gave myself 9 out of 10 for the presentation, it doesn't mean I'm going to hit 9 out of 10 again because I enact those clues, because I'm in my HPM again. It might turn a 5 out of 10 into a 6 out of 10, or 4 out of 10 into a 7 out of 10. It just optimizes my performance. It gives me my best possible performance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always think when you've hit the vein of something really good, it almost organically becomes a bumper sticker or a 40-character tweet. As complicated as human behavior is and human performance is, a really good nugget is something that has this organic simplicity to it. And you just said excellence leaves clues. I think that's a nugget right there, right? So let's kind of unwrap that thought process. What do you mean by excellence leaves clues? It's a very powerful statement. I love it.
Excellence leaves clues. So if we completely unwrap that, I would say that when I perform at my best or close to my best, I'm engaging in excellence. Excellence can be trapped behaviorally. We can extract data, behavioral data, from excellence. Now, interesting thing, at least I think it's interesting. I think as an athlete yourself, you can trap more than behavioral data. You can trap emotional data. You can trap cognitive data. You can trap motivational data. You can the not just the interpersonal but the intrapersonal. So I can go back and relive that, and I can think about how I felt internally, where those sensations were in my body with relation to how I behaved. So those are the clues I'm getting. Those are the clues I'm getting from that excellence. And I want to write down those clues. Cognitive, motivational, emotional, behavioral. If you're a coach, I think by and large you're looking at the behavioral data. You're looking from the outside and you're seeing gestures and body language and actions. Sorry, go on, you were going to...
No. I think you're onto something. I don't want to interrupt because I like your flow. I think the other thing that I would emphasize is you talked about internal and external clues too, right? So it's not just the room, but also what's going on inside. And it's funny, right? Because in the world of psychology, again, trying to avoid the poppy, buzzy types of words, whether we're talking about signal versus noise or feedback loops or all that, and you're kind of sterilizing it a little bit to just say data. But I think what you're talking about is an awareness. So that way, when it feels right, you're aware of why it feels right. And similarly, when it feels wrong, you're aware of why it feels wrong. And I almost wonder if it's a non-judgmental awareness. It's just sort of like, oh, this is the experience that's happening. And now I need to understand what elements of these experiences are linked to this particular type of outcome. Am I catching that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a certain... whether outcome is the right term, especially in sport, because I think if we break it down, we've got outcome, we've got performance, we've got mindset. And I think that, in that instance, the outcome, I suppose you define as it's well received, it's not well received. If we're going to have a binary win-lose, it's well received, it's not well received, in terms of my presentation. The performance is the performance. It's how I'm going about that from a behavioural perspective. It's what I'm saying. It's what I'm delivering. It's the information, but it's also how I'm delivering that information. The mindset is linked to that.
So let's swing the pendulum to the other direction. I'm sure you've had a moment, like athletes and sports psychologists, where you've had a bad beat or a hard moment. What would you say was the contributing element or cause? And what was the lesson that you learned from that moment?
For me personally, it goes wrong if I'm not putting in effortful control, if I'm not in charge of myself in a performance moment. Like everyday life, I think, you can't always put in effortful control. But I think in your performance moments, if it goes wrong, and it continues to go wrong, it's because it's gone wrong and it's impacted your mindset. You've gone down to a low performance mindset, and that's exacerbated what's gone wrong. So let me put it in golf speak. In golf speak, I don't know, I hit it out of bounds. My job now for me, in my world, in my opinion, in my consultancy practice, is it doesn't matter that it's gone out of bounds. You are still in charge of you. You are still in charge of you. You're retaining a sense of control. You are staying in what I would call a game face, my game face. I'm staying in my game face. When it goes wrong is when I allow that circumstance to dictate my mindset, and I drop down to my low performance mindset. So I might be distracted, I might drop in intensity, so drop in activation levels. I might start to become inhibited, and I suppose compete with a bit of fear. That's when it goes wrong for me. I have to stay in charge. Why I think a mental skills framework is so important is because, for me, a great competitor is someone who stays in charge no matter what. I know that can be critiques and people could push back at that, but for me as a sports psychologist, if we're talking strictly about performance, for me, I think I'm going to take a side path here, but come back. We are so socialized in sport into outcome and performance. We are so socialized in sport into a competitor is somebody who is focused on outcome. Got to win, want to win. You'll recognize that language pattern, REBT, right? Must win, have to win, yeah. But the same with performance. Got to perform. There's no flex there. Because we're socialized into, well, what's a competitor? Well, Dan, a competitor is somebody who has the will to win, really wants to win at all costs, maybe. Got to perform, want to be man or woman of the match, got to make it happen. Come on, the legends make it happen. Scott, the legends of the game make it happen. Hey, look, that may or may not be true. But for me, and that we're so tough on ourselves with performance and so tolerant on ourselves with mindset, I think we can reverse that. Maybe actually this is where I step away slightly from REBT, but I think we can be more tolerant on ourselves with performance and tough on ourselves with mindset. And when I work with players, I want them to be passionate about a high performance mindset. I want their narrative, or I put to them that optimal is potentially Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. My job on the pitch, the court, the course, the field is HPM. I know what that looks like. I know what that feels like. I know what others will see. HPM. I'm going to practice this Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, going into my Saturday, Sunday game. That's what I'm going to do. And when I come to the game, I come to the match, my number one job is HPM, high performance mindset. Now, as part of that explanatory system, as part of that meaning system, that narrative and meaning, for me, it then goes on this direction. My job is HPM. That's where I'm going to be tougher on myself. It doesn't matter what the opposition throw at me. It doesn't matter if I'm on my C game. It doesn't matter if I spend a few minutes down at 4 or 5 out of 10. I make a mistake. I give the ball away. My cross goes into row Z. I miss a great chance to score. Whatever it is, whatever sport you're playing, I stay in that HPM no matter what. I think that's potentially where we can give ourselves permission to be more rigid with our language. Potentially. Now, I think what that does then, that narrative then stretches onto, that helps me have my best possible performance. That's where we can be more flex and more adaptive around performance. My best possible performance. It's not saying if I'm in my HPM and I'm in my HPM for 95 minutes, 80 minutes, however long the game is, that I'm definitely going to have my best performance. I'm not saying that. That doesn't exist. What I am saying is if I can be in my HPM non-stop, no matter what happens, nothing and no one takes me away from my HPM, then I can have my best possible performance. I can turn 4s into 6s, 5s into 7s, 7s into 8s. I'm going to make a bold statement, but I think if players work every day, make HPM a skill that they're going to improve upon every day, I'm going to make a bold statement and say, unless injury or some off-pitch, off-field incident happens, anything underneath 6 out of 10 will rarely happen, because I think you will be equipped to deal with anything that's thrown at you. That is absolutely not. I get that, because all kinds of funky things happen in sport. I really get that. But I want to say here that I think if we can get that HPM really good, we certainly optimise our ability to perform our best possible game. And I think we open up that corridor between 6 and 9 out of 10 so much more often, and we start to really eliminate the 5s and the 4s. And those 5s and the 4s are the ones that kill careers. I know I'm talking of subjective scores here, but athletes by and large know what a 4 or a 5 or a 6 or 7 out of 10 looks like in their game.
So our 8, 9 HPMs, are they liberated or tortured?
I think it varies. I think, so what I want you to put in your mind here is, maybe I haven't quite put it in yours and maybe the audience's mind, is there's 2 scales here. There's a performance scale and there's a mindset scale. There's a performance scale and there's a mindset scale. I want players to be passionate about that mindset scale, because they're always passionate about the performance scale, but their irrational thoughts, feelings, anxieties, neuroticisms happen around that scale, in my opinion. And then you've got outcome next to that as well. So that mindset scale with HPM down to LPM, HPM, that's where I want players to be passionate. Now, on that HPM scale, is 7, 8, 9 out of 10 liberating, or is it, I can't remember the word you used, but is it
tortured?
Tortured. I think that on some days it either it clicks into place, and that could be a number of varying factors, where you're warming up and bang, 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 and you feel good, and it's there. So it clicks into place. It happens. It feels liberating. It is liberating. I love your word of tortured, and or hate your word of tortured, and I think it's a fair word. And I think some days it is torture to get up there. And I think that part of HPM could be trusting and letting go. I get that. I know that. I understand that. But some days I think you do have to work very hard. That might be working hard with something as basic as your self-talk, to keep yourself in the game. That might be engaging with a teammate and asking him or her to help you, because, and this is admitting vulnerability, this is exercising vulnerability because you're not quite there. And that in and of itself might feel like a torturous moment because you're relying on somebody else. Again, there will be individual differences there. So I think that, and if I go back to golf, there's no doubts that some rounds are tortured. If you're on your C game or your D game, in golf I wouldn't necessarily use a performance scale of 1 to 10, I might use A, B, C, D, because it fits neater into golf, probably tennis as well. Might be an individual sport thing. If I'm on my C game, a real secret, in my opinion, of tour golf, the players who can play their C game and shoot under par are the ones who earn a lot of money. And the players who can play their A game and get the most out of their A game, because they go around 8, 9, 10 under par. The players who play their C game and can shoot under par, you are earning money. You are going to make money. in golf if your ability is good enough. But the capacity to shoot under par on your C game is predicated or mediated by your ability to stay in your HPM while you're on your C game, while you're watching a lot of shots, that are quite wayward. And that's challenging to do. And that feels like torture. You're standing there, you feel your swing looks like an octopus falling out of a tree. It feels horrible. It feels tight and tense. But you've got to somehow get it around that golf course. And that feels like torture. But you've got to. Now, 90% of players capitulate. It's not my day. This is rubbish. I don't want to be here. What am I doing here? Hey, that was me. Right? No. That to me is where you've got to fight. In my opinion. There's a wealth of different ideas, but that's to me is where you've got to fight.
Yeah, there was a golfer that I was working with who mentioned something very similar. He said the secret to professional golf is the ability to grind through the days you don't have it, because every elite professional athlete has the moment where it's just not happening, it's just not clicking for whatever reason, and that if you want to make money on the tour, he said, those days you got to find some way, somehow, to keep grinding through it, because it won't last forever. Like, he had that insight, it won't last forever. So it was interesting, and maybe that goes back to the question of universal truth. Maybe the universal truth is what causes people to stay on point or on task when the experience is analogous to torture. Not literal, because we want to keep things in perspective, but analogous to this idea of raging discomfort.
And I think if I was to articulate that, I would say that is effortful control. Conscientiousness, if you take the personality trait of conscientiousness, high conscientious people are industrious and orderly. Industriousness, they will stick to tasks no matter what. And obviously there's, what's come into the literature over the last decade has been grit, and grit correlates with the personality trait of conscientiousness. I mean, there's been some dissent from some personality psychologists around this notion of grit, because they're saying, hang on, this is just conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is not as funky a title as grit, especially for sport, but they're saying, look, the research literature is there, cross-culturally it's there, that people who report high in conscientiousness are putting in effortful control. And there's longitudinal studies that suggest that 3-year-olds who are documented as high conscientiousness are high conscientious in their 20s. So it's there's some very, very interesting empirical evidence around that. But the interesting thing is effortful control, for me, in my opinion, from my reading, is both a trait and an adaptation, a strategy, if you like. So anybody can improve their capacity to engage in effortful control. But just one last thing here is that this does not, in my opinion, and this is where I have a lot of Twitter debates, worst platform ever to debate on, shouldn't do it, Scott, disgraceful, you're far too intelligent to do it, so you don't, is putting in effortful control is different to saying you can control your attitude. It's different to saying attitude is a choice. I think that is a coaching axiom, if axiom is the right word, that is incorrect. I don't think attitude is 100% controllable. The human system is too complex for that, and I don't think attitude is a choice. Within that coaching environment, I think it is, we're going on to a different subject here, so I apologise. I think that it is incumbent on coaches and in their environment to be able to deliver processes within a coaching practice to help attitude or behaviour become more of a choice for players, for participants. And we have to be very careful, because as soon as we say, well, attitude is a choice, or you can control your attitude without providing skills or an environment that lends itself to that kind of philosophy, then we are externalizing locus of control. We are not saying that coaching is a co-creation and a negotiation. We're putting a barrier between ourselves and our players and going, hey, it's your responsibility, it's not mine. I can't coach your attitude, effort and energy. It's up to you. You've got to bring it to the table. And I'm not diminishing personal responsibility. I'm just saying incumbent on coaches, or within, if you want to be the best coach you can be, you have, in my opinion, you have to engage in a practice and have to create an environment that helps athletes become better at effortful control, because that is what will help them become more conscientious, gritty, and see them through.
It's interesting. Sometimes I think information reminds me of food, or maybe it's just because it's close to lunchtime right now for me. But you can tell that, like a really good cheeseburger, it tastes good in and of itself, but it's maybe a simpler food versus something that's really sophisticated, like a Wagyu, filet mignon or something. And both have their flavor profiles. One might be more simple in texture and taste. One might be incredibly sophisticated, but they both have their value. I think what you just laid out was a Kobe beef, ribeye steak with truffle butter. It's going to take a while to really digest the nuances and the sophistication of that flavor. I would like to go back a couple clicks where you talked about getting into an intellectual debate. You mentioned it on Twitter. It's interesting. When I was trained as a scientist, one of my mentors said, the least sophisticated argument is one where you get locked into the methods section. So, it's funny, right? Because someone will propose an idea or a concept, and then when people want to just, trash it, or they go after the methods section, and every methods section has some kind of inherent weakness. I find similarly in the world of application and applied science, we get lost in the debate of language and terminology. So it's like, well, what exactly do you mean by a thought? Or what do you exactly mean by a HPM? And it's like, well, rather than get into the debate of the word or what word is better used, it's like, well, let's just think about the concept. And what's the conceptualization or the mechanism or the principal drive in what we're discussing? It's funny because when people try to win an argument, they focus on the language. Well, you said this. But when people are trying to go on a more adventurous exploration, they go, well, wait, I just want to digest the concept, which brings us back to the Kobe ribeye with truffle butter. Another element that you talked about in that statement was how popular grit is and how people are kind of debating it. And that's something I've been digesting a lot lately, is watching how much the herd, whatever the group is, will react or respond to the next buzzworthy thing or the next poppy thing. So whether it's mindfulness or grit or, some of these things I support and really believe in. So it's great when the herd goes in that direction. Others, I'm like, that doesn't quite resonate with me. So I'm like, well, I'll just ride this wave out and wait till the herd shifts gears again. Whether it's about accountability coaches versus relational coaches. I mean, whatever the concept is, it's really interesting to watch, especially in how the herd shifts to and then locks onto. So that's an awfully long setup for the next question that I have, which is, what are you most curious about today? What are you fascinated about? What do you think is coming next? Let's start the herd shift. What is the concept that we're going to shift the herd towards?
I can give you the concept that we won't shift to woods, but I'm most fascinated in, and that's personality science. And I think we have to find a way. The way I'm going to answer this is kind of saying, this is what I'm really into at the moment, fascinated with. I have my own questions about it. And I suppose related to the attitude thing is that appreciating nuance of individual differences is imperative for coaching excellence. And I think, let's keep this topical. Many of us have watched the Last Dance documentary. And I've been writing quite a bit on it. I do a little article most days on LinkedIn. And I do think it's been a really interesting documentary, edited though it is. And I think it's been interesting in terms of how Phil Jackson, and I want to emphasize, edited even though it is, dealt with his players. I mean, he's renowned for what he achieved. I don't know the nuts and bolts. I don't know the ins and outs. Ethically, as sports psychologists, we have to announce that I wasn't there. But it seems like that he was very aware of the differences in individuals and what they required. I think we need better ways to trap. Again, I'm going to use the term data, that behavioural data, or the person. What a lot of people don't appreciate is what personality scientists would say is there's 2 to 3 levels of personality here. Meaning we can't figure out, well, Dennis Rodman is like this, Michael Jordan is like that, so-and-so is like this player's like... We can't do that. But what we can do is have psychologically informed environments whereby we have, and that might be where we're going to circle back, because I think psychologically informed environments, there's the thing, whereby a psychologically informed environment is one where, as a group of coaches, we sit down and the conversations we have about our players take into account the thoughts, emotions, experiences, and personalities of our players. We have more informed conversations about our people. Not just about the X's and the O's, but about our people. But here's the thing. I don't think it can just be about... It's a cliche in English football. Know your players. Know your players. It's a buzz term every single coach will use. Oh, you got to know your players. Yeah, you do. How do you know your players? Now, we know in personality science that people are too complex for us to completely know. Behavior is complex. Why? Because human beings are goal-orientated, adaptive systems. Okay, we are designed, our basal ganglia, our limbic system is designed to adapt in the moment. But we still have typical behavioral responses in given circumstances. We still have behavioral tendencies. So my argument is that we can use trait theory, so the 5 traits. My argument is passionate coaches who are probably professional coaches because they've got the time. They're not grassroots coaches, mum and dad coaching, dude 9 to 5, and coaching. You don't have time for this, probably, possibly. But I don't think there's any excuse for your college coaches, your NBA, your NFL, your MLB, your Premier League coaches not to have a reasonable grasp of the extroversion dimension, conscientiousness, agreeableness, openness, and neuroticism dimension. Horrible term, neurotic, and they are horrible terms. They're scientific terms. They're horrible, granted. I think there is time for those coaches to be able to learn a little bit and learn about what empirical evidence has told us about these people. So low agreeable people or players, athletes, they're the ones who tend to be uncoachable in inverted commas. We need to have a more informed conversation about those players so we can have better strategies to be able to deal with them. Not just say, oh, we're not going to recruit that player because that player's not coachable. That player might have a great deal of skill in their feet or skill in their hands. We need to find better coaching processes that enables us to find a way to coach those players, or worse way, help that player or those players to be able to coach themselves. You can do that through divergent questioning. You can do that. So I think I'm going to put to people that we need an understanding of personality, the structure of personality. That's not knowing them, but it's having a structure to have a psychologically informed environment. And I think that we can have better conversations that way. Sorry, mate, I know you wanted to say something.
No. I'm listening and actually taking notes because I think this is solid gold. If I were to summarize what you said, just to make sure there's some accuracy here, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong or refine it, because I think this is important, what you just laid out, it would be, though incredibly complicated, to understand the person and the interaction between people is the best way to maximize the player and ultimately the team.
Yes.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
So now let's circle back to the question. Is that where you think people are? Is that where the herd is now going, or is that the way? Is this the wave you want to start?
It's a wave I'd love to start. Whether I'd be that influential, I think it is a part of that psychological. I'm going to use two terms here. In terms of, certainly in the UK, I think where the herd is going is towards psychological safety. And so by psychological safety, I mean the work of Amy Edson, Harvard University, did her, I think it might have been her PhD theory or postdoctoral research on medical departments that were highly successful, and she realised the ones that were highly successful were the ones who were making the most mistakes. However, she then realised it was questionable whether they were making more mistakes than other departments. What they were doing was they were just admitting their mistakes. So they had a psychologically safe environment where they sat down around the table and they could have a conversation and go, hey, look, I made this mistake here. What do you guys think? What do you think I should be doing in future? Etc., etc. There was a safe environment to be vulnerable and to have difficult conversations and to brainstorm solutions, to co-create solutions with colleagues. I think the herd, certainly in the UK, is going in that direction, which I think will open up opportunities for psychological frameworks like solution-focused brief therapy, REBT, and motivational interviewing, being more involved in national governing bodies, CPDs, so continuing professional development programs. And I think it will become more a part of the fabric of coaching. Again, not coaching across the board. I'm talking about coaching that's more full-time. Because grassroots coaches have much less time. That needs to be treated probably in a different way, slightly different way. So I think I want to say these terms, psychological safety, but I think the overarching principle there is a psychologically informed environment, PIE, PI, and that actually comes from homelessness services here in the UK. What homelessness services wanted to do, and I can't remember, and I apologise to them, the two psychologists who one was a researcher, one was a psychologist who came up with this term, their complaint was social services looked at homelessness in terms of either the environment or the person. And they said, no, hang on, there's more of a psychosocial dynamic here, and we need our social services to appreciate there's an interaction and a combination. So what we want our social services to be is a psychologically informed environment where we have better conversations about these people, about the interaction between the psychology and the environment of the person. And I think sport, think of your NFL team, your NBA teams, think of Premier League. I think they need to have a shift towards the psychologically informed environment to be able to optimize the performance, the learning, and the well-being of their participants, of their competitors.
It's interesting listening to you. It makes me wonder if another sort of common truth is, in order for innovation to occur and advancement to occur, whether it's in sport or some other domain, i.e. the Fosbury flop, it involves philosophical approach and quote unquote professional thinkers. And maybe that's something, no matter what our expertise is, leadership, mental skills, etc., maybe the thing that we all provide as practitioners is an opportunity for really smart and talented people, because that's what at the most elite levels the athletes and the coaches are. I mean, when there's only 32 NFL teams and you're a head coach of one of them, you're in pretty rarefied air and you have to be pretty dynamic to hold that seat. And so maybe one of the things that we provide is the opportunity for people to think. And when they think, when they take a little bit of space to think, they end up coming up with a new way to jump over the high bar, i.e. let's go backwards this time rather than forwards. Fosbury flop. So circling back to the statement, excellence leaves clues, I think there are a lot of clues that you've left in our conversation today. But in an effort to be comprehensive, I guess my last question to you would be this. Is there anything that we missed? Was there a question I should have asked but didn't? Is there an idea that you go, wait, I kind of wish we could circle back on this for a sec? Or did we put it all out there?
So, first thing to say, great question. First thing to say, I just want to briefly come back at you and what you said, which was brilliant. What you said, the thinking space, it reminds me of I've got lots of favourite episodes of the Sport Psych Show and lots of great moments and stuff. But I want to say that number one, our conversation when you spoke about having more time to talk philosophically with the coaching staff or the head coach, I completely agree with that notion. I think that, and actually, I'm going to bring in two other episodes. Dr. Steve Bull, who's a veteran of the sports psychology, so I hope he won't mind me using that term, but he's semi-retired now, but incredible sports psychologist, on our episode about mental toughness, because he did a lot of work around mental toughness in the late 90s that has really impacted what we do now in the UK. And we started to talk about personality science at the end, and he said, Dan, we're talking about this stuff, and really the PST stuff, the MST, the mental skills training, the psychological skills training, in many respects, maybe what we need to be doing, if we think of integration, we need to be helping coaches become more autonomous at doing that stuff and leave room for us to have deeper philosophical conversations around individual differences, for example, in tune with what you said on the episode and in tune with what you've just said in the last 5 minutes. And then another episode just from a few weeks ago, Dr. Andrew Abraham, a fantastic coach developer, academic and coach developer at Leeds Beckett University, UK. And he used the term, and I love this term, and I want to use this because of what you said, thinking tools. We need more thinking tools in this space. Coaches need more thinking tools, and I think that structure of personality can be a thinking tool. Empirical evidence can be a thinking tool. The stuff I talk about in a Sport Psych Show, thinking tool. Now, so that's all I wanted to say there. Just to close, you know what? There was one question we didn't, and we'll be brief. The self-actualization. You asked me about self-actualization, I was answering, and you came in with a really, really good question, a little bit into my answer. I'm certainly nowhere near at self-actualization, never will be. All that kind of cliched stuff. But I would say is the Sport Psych Show podcast is one thing that has been just awesome for me, because I think what I was answering at that time was saying I do have a bias towards mental skills training, and I think, and from my playing career and my coaching career, I can have a bias towards sometimes ignoring the empirical evidence and going off on my own flight of fancy, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that, because I do think I was having a conversation with somebody recently, a sports psychologist, and that person said to me, saying something, and then she said, "Oh, well, I can't say that because we haven't tested it." And it's like, whoa, you don't have to stop. Okay, this isn't logical positivism here. It's just like you can have an opinion. You can work experientially as well. So there's that. So I think that what the Sport Psych Show has helped me to do is just understand incredible work from incredible people, and just broadened and deepened my knowledge, and helped me work towards that impossible goal of self-actualization.
It's funny, right? Because when they do literature about therapy, they said the people that benefit the most from therapy are the therapists, because they get to kind of tackle different problems from different angles as the patients come in and ask for their support and resource, right? Plus, they also get a chance to practice and get their reps in as a therapist providing said intervention. So it makes perfect sense to me that you would say, hey, the way you get better is by having all these really wonderful intellectual conversations with some of the leading experts in the field, and to have 100 of them under your belt is something that's pretty special. Congratulations on 100 episodes. That is not an easy feat. And, cheers to you, mate, for really doing some amazing work and helping spread some incredibly important information out there. I thank you for everything that you've done.
I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. It's been a brilliant conversation. I've learnt loads, and just by doing this, it gets you really, really thinking about your own ideas. So, Scott, thank you so much for taking up 2 hours of your time. So thank you so much, mate.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast. It was a little bit different, wasn't it? And I hope you enjoyed it as well. And I'd certainly love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Well, I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.